When a wealthy heiress, with more diamonds than patience, sneered at the hotel's quiet janitor, her voice carried the bite of a dare. "If you can play that piano better than a pro, I'll marry you." She expected laughter. She got a night that would tear her certainty apart. That evening, New York glimmered under its own crown of lights. At the Whitmore Grand's entrance, cameras sparked, gowns shimmered, and footsteps echoed on marble. Inside, glassware chimed like a polite warning. Somewhere beyond the chandeliers waited a black piano. Direct hit. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow the story gets even bigger. The chandelier above the Whitmore Grand's great hall shimmered like a frozen sun, its lattice of gold and crystal refracting the warm glow into 1,000 polite shards. Each prism scattered light across the marble below, catching on the polished curves of champagne flutes, on the subtle sparkle of evening gowns, on the cool edges of silver cufflinks. Soft exhale from the entrance to the far wall, the floor stretched like a mirror, unbroken, except for the soft interruption of footsteps and the trailing sweep of expensive fabric. The scent in the air was layered, the faint citrus of cologne, the powdery ghost of expensive perfume, the buttery whisper of hors d'oeuvres carried past on gleaming trays. Waiters moved like clockwork currents, weaving between clusters of guests without spilling a drop, each tray balanced on their fingers as though weightless. Subtle pause, they knew how to slide past conversation without becoming part of it, how to anticipate the subtle lean of a guest's arm before a glass was raised. Along the hall's edge, a string ensemble played from behind a delicate arrangement of flowers, their music light enough to be mistaken for part of the decor. The violin's high line was bright and clear, the cello's low hum grounded the room in civility, but it was all background, sound designed to vanish under the smooth tide of small talk and clinking crystal. Marcus Reed kept to the outer ring of the hall, pushing his cart with the quiet precision of someone who had long ago learned how to become invisible. Slow, measured tone, his dark gloves muffled the small sounds of work, the shift of glass against glass, the faint rustle of linen. Every tool on the cart was folded, stacked, or placed at the exact angle he preferred, not because anyone else would notice, but because discipline in the unseen parts made the seen parts seamless. Lowered voice in his world, invisibility was not absence. It was a practiced skill, and it was survival. He knew the rules of the Whitmore Grand without needing to read them. Firm, quiet intensity staff entered through the side alley, through a metal door the guests would never see. They moved along the service corridors, past the laundry chutes and ice machines, and emerged only when necessary, careful to stay outside the camera's eye. A misplaced step into the wrong line of sight could draw the quick tilt of a chin from a PR coordinator, a signal, not rude but final, to fade back into the shadows. Pause, the kind of instruction given without words, as if gravity itself was simply stronger in the corners. A PR staffer glided past him now, one hand on her headset, the other holding a clipboard to her chest. Quick professional tone, "Keep staff out of frame, please," she murmured into the mic, eyes already on another part of the room. She didn't speak to him directly, she spoke to someone else about him, as though Marcus were a chess piece being moved in real time. Slight exhale still, he stepped to the side, angling the cart so she could pass without breaking stride. Reflex. Always reflex. He had learned the small dance steps of avoidance. 2 side steps before collision, turn shoulders to narrow the space you occupy, keep your eyes level but unfocused, so no one mistakes your gaze for an invitation. Across the room, beyond the polite whirl of dresses and tailored suits, a black Steinway waited on a low stage. Its lid was closed, the glossy surface gathering the chandelier's light like a pool of still water under moonlight. Soft, nostalgic tone, the polished brass of the pedals caught flashes from the photographer's bulbs. Marcus's eyes rested there a heartbeat too long, not because he had time to linger, but because that curve of black lacquer was a door to another lifetime. Voice tinged with longing, the faint reflection of the hall on its surface was like a double exposure. The grand room now, overlaid with a memory of cool ivory keys beneath his fingertips, of sound that had once belonged to him. Pause, he looked away before the ache had time to deepen, pushing the cart onward with a small exhale. Near the main entrance, A man in a tailored suit waved him over with the casual authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Brisk, impersonal keys," the man said, dropping them into Marcus's palm without so much as a glance at his face. Marcus closed his fingers around the cool metal. "Neutral, professional, I'm maintenance staff, sir. Valets out front." The man blinked once, retrieving the keys with a clipped "ah," his gaze already sliding elsewhere. Dry, quiet observation, that was how these moments worked. Interest only so long as you were useful. The second you weren't, you dissolved from their attention like steam. It was then that the focus of the room shifted. Dramatic pause, the slow ripple of camera flashes toward the grand entrance signaled the arrival of the evening's most PHOTOGAPHED guest. Victoria Whitmore appeared, the red silk of her gown moving like liquid flame as she crossed the carpet. Commanding, vivid, her diamonds didn't just sparkle, they asserted themselves, each facet catching the light like a punctuation mark in a sentence she had written herself. She took the microphone at the center of the room with a PICTICD smile, her posture a lesson in command. "Clear, resonant, we are here tonight to remind one another that hope has a place," she said, her voice bright as polished glass. Applause rolled through the room like a wave meeting the shore at the expected time. Marcus continued clearing a table near the edge, but he could feel the way her presence bent the air around her. Low, observant, she wasn't just speaking to the guests, she was conducting them. Each laugh, each sigh, each tilt of a head in approval was part of the score she controlled. And then sudden shift, the first note of disruption sounded. A champagne flute tipped as someone turned, its pale gold contents arcing in a brief glitter before striking the silk of Victoria's gown. Sharp intake of breath, it left a mark, thin but unmistakable, across the curve of fabric. The room seemed to inhale as one, holding the breath, as if afraid to disturb the moment's surface. Marcus had been reaching under a table for a runaway glass when it happened. He straightened to find her already turning toward him, eyes fixed, her voice sharp enough to slice through the music. "What do you think you're doing?" He placed the glass on his tray, palms open to the air. Calm, measured. "I'm sorry, ma'am, sorry," she cut in, the word carrying the weight of disbelief. Cold, cutting. "Do you know how much this dress costs?" It wasn't a question meant to be answered. It was a reminder of distance. Somewhere behind her, a soft chuckle rose from a cluster of guests. "Mocking, distant, no janitors covering that bill," someone said, the humor thin as paper. Another voice, male, amused. "People like you should stick to the back." Quiet, bitter observation, no one addressed him directly. The words were tossed into the space like coins into a fountain, meant to be heard, but not responded to. Marcus felt the familiar pull toward retreat. Slow, tense, the safe route was always to back away, to slip through the service door and let the moment wash past. But something in him held. "Steady, firm, I can pay for the cleaning," he said evenly, though both of them knew the arithmetic made it impossible. Her expression didn't soften. If anything, she sharpened it into performance, reclaiming the center of attention. Dramatic, mocking. "How about this?" she said. "If you can play that piano better than a professional, I'll marry you." The laughter that followed was swift and bright, the kind used to smooth over discomfort, but beneath it ran the quiet undertow of expectation, not that he would succeed, but that he would provide entertainment by failing. Rapid, chaotic bills appeared in hands as quickly as the dare had been thrown. 500 if he makes it through a whole piece, 1,000 if he lasts more than 30 seconds. The wagers stacked up like stage props. Marcus shook his head once. "Resolute, I'm not taking your money," he said. "Then what do you want?" a man called from the crowd. Marcus held Victoria's gaze. "Quiet challenge, if I can do it, you keep your word." The air in the room shifted, the way it does when the audience isn't sure if the performance is still a comedy. Pregnant pause, Victoria's smile thinned, but she kept it in place. "Perfect," she said. "Show us, buddy." Bitter edge, the word landed with the weight of habit, the casual diminishment of someone whose name you never bothered to learn. Marcus removed his gloves, folding them into a neat square before setting them on the tray. Deliberate, controlled, each movement was deliberate, as if he were drawing a boundary in the open. He stepped forward, and with each footfall, the hum of conversation thinned. Building tension, 2 security guards moved in on instinct, their formation polite but solid. It was David Chen, the music critic, who broke the standoff. Authoritative, calm, "Let him through," he said in a tone that carried without force. The guards hesitated, then stepped aside just enough to allow passage. The Steinway's surface was cool under his palm. Soft, reverent. For a moment, he didn't open it. He stood there, feeling the tension in the air tighten like a string wound one turn too many. "Clear, unwavering, Miss Whitmore," he said, voice carrying clearly across the room. "I want to hear you say it. I will keep my word." A flicker passed across her face, a moment's resistance, then she nodded. Reluctant, "I will keep my word." It sounded almost like she was testing the taste of it. Marcus lifted the lid. Dramatic flourish, the light caught on the ivory keys, and for the first time all evening, something in him shifted from guarded to present. He sat, adjusted the bench, and let his fingers hover, not pressing, just letting the weight of possibility settle. First note soft, haunting. The first note was soft, intentional, like touching water without breaking the surface. Then another. The melody formed without rushing, as if it had all the time it needed. Breathless silence somewhere in the crowd. A man lowered his phone. Laughter that had lingered at the edges began to thin. The night tilted. The sound Marcus drew from the keys was nothing like the tentative, halting trial the crowd had prepared to mock. It was measured but alive, each note carrying the kind of confidence that came from living with music rather than merely practicing it. His left hand set a steady foundation, soft but deliberate, as though he were laying the stones of a path one at a time. The right hand moved with restraint, not reaching for flashy flourishes or unnecessary speed, but finding exactly the pitch and weight each note required. He played as if the room had always been meant to listen, and for the first time that night, it did. The marble floor seemed to absorb and release the sound in equal measure, sending it curling under tables and between clusters of frozen guests. The edges of conversation dissolved. Waiters who had been threading their way through the crowd slowed their steps, unwilling to clink glass against glass. The chandelier's glitter softened. Light no longer felt like a spotlight, but like something more natural, cast without discrimination. The sound reached places Marcus could not see, the security guards at the perimeter, the bartender leaning against the back counter, the coat check attendant who had not been able to hear the string quartet over the noise before now. At a table near the front, a man who had earlier joked about white keys, black keys, had his smile interrupted. His glass of champagne held Medea. He wasn't sure when he stopped smirking, only that the urge to maintain it had slipped away without warning. Across the aisle, a woman lowered her phone, not because she had stopped recording, but because she didn't want to see the music through a screen. She set it face down on the table, as though the act of holding it upright might somehow intrude on the sound. David Chen, leaning slightly forward in his chair, was cataloging details the way a critic's mind inevitably did. The clean articulation of a passing note, the subtle delay between the melody and its echo in the bass, the absence of pedal haze where others might have hidden imperfect transitions. He noticed, too, what Marcus was not doing: no showmanship, no stolen glances at the crowd, no calculated swelling of volume to force applause. There was a kind of precision here that only came from years of discipline carried quietly, away from the lights. Victoria Whitmore kept her expression arranged, the faint smile of a hostess who knows she's being watched from every angle, but something under the surface had shifted. She had prepared two outcomes in her mind: the predictable failure or the surprising but containable success that could be spun into a publicity angle. Neither matched what was unfolding. This was not just a hidden talent being revealed. This was a complete rearrangement of the room's hierarchy. She found her gaze drawn not to Marcus's hands, but to his stillness, the kind that did not ask for permission to exist in the center of the room. The melody turned a corner, slipping into a minor key, just enough to deepen the air. Marcus held one note a fraction longer than expected, and that delay created a silence that pressed gently against the crowd, as though inviting them to lean closer. Someone at the back did so without thinking, their movements setting off a quiet ripple of shifting postures. Conversations that had been whispered even after the first notes now evaporated entirely. The collective attention in the room began to feel less like an accident and more like an agreement. Marcus kept his eyes half-lidded, not out of theatrical affectation, but because he was listening to the way the sound landed against the walls, to the way it returned like an echo from another room. He did not scan the faces in front of him, did not measure the reaction, did not need to. The piece was not for their approval, it was a reintroduction. Every bar he played seemed to remove another layer of the invisible glass that had kept him on the margins. From her position near the wall, Gloria Johnson, the senior housekeeper, felt her throat tighten. She had seen Marcus work every shift without drawing attention, blending into the building's undercurrent like water moving through pipes. She had also seen him pause near the unused piano in the staff lounge on rare mornings, his fingers twitching once before he walked past. Now, watching him in full view, she recognized the sound of someone who had been carrying an entire language inside and had finally decided to speak it aloud. As the melody returned to its opening theme, Marcus chose a tempo just slightly slower than before, letting the final phrases open wide and then close without flourish. He lifted his fingers and pressed the pedal one last time, holding it long enough for the last chord to fully dissolve into the air. Then he let the pedal rise, and with it came silence, not the awkward, waiting kind, but a silence that felt full, as though it had its own weight. No one clapped immediately. It wasn't hesitation. It was the natural pause that comes when people are unsure how to move after standing too close to something that matters. A single set of hands began, somewhere at the left, and the sound spread, filling the hall in an uneven but building rhythm. Marcus didn't bow. He sat with his hands resting loosely in his lap, letting the applause find its own level. Victoria's mind moved fast. She could feel the night slipping from her control, each second rewriting the shape of the story in ways she hadn't anticipated. A part of her wanted to reclaim it immediately, step forward, make a quip, pull the audience back into the comfort of her script. But another part, smaller yet harder to ignore, recognized that any interruption now would feel like a theft. She kept still, her gaze locked on the man at the piano, the dare she had thrown now hanging in the air like a live wire. Marcus stood, not hurriedly, but with the same measured calm he had brought to each note. He turned slightly toward Victoria, not in deference, but in acknowledgement, as if to say, "Your move." Around the edges of the room, servers straightened their posture unconsciously, as though the act of watching him take his place at the center had altered the way they understood their own. A voice from the middle of the crowd called out, half teasing, half testing, "So when's the wedding?" A ripple of laughter followed, softer than before, and then another voice, this one sharper, added, "She said she'd keep her word." Several heads turned toward Victoria. The energy in the room tightened again, expectant. She stepped forward, her smile returning, but the sound of her heels against the marble was not quite as confident as before. "It seems," she began, "we've discovered that talent can come from unexpected places." The line earned a polite smattering of applause, but it wasn't enough to shift the focus away from the agreement she had made. David Chen rose slightly from his chair, his voice even. "He played at a professional level," he said. "That was the bet." His words landed with the weight of authority, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again. Marcus didn't move to press the point. He simply met her eyes and waited. It was not the look of a man demanding repayment. It was the look of someone who had already given what he came to give and was waiting to see whether the other side would stand by their own words. The pause stretched, and in that space, the stakes became clear to everyone watching. This was no longer about a joke, a stain, or even a performance. This was about whether a promise made in public would hold. A murmur spread like wind over tall grass, subtle but insistent. People were no longer hiding their glances toward Victoria. The moment that had begun as playful spectacle was taking on the gravity of a test, one that everyone in the room understood instinctively. She had been the one to set the rules. Now the crowd waited to see if she would follow them. Victoria's eyes swept over the faces in front of her, donors, shareholders, journalists, and the few invited guests whose influence extended far beyond the hall. They were watching closely, some with quiet amusement, others with a more pointed kind of curiosity. "I said I would keep my word," she began, her tone carrying both a warning and an assurance, "and I intend to." The statement hung in the air, deliberately ambiguous, offering no specific interpretation, but before she could steer the moment back into her control, a voice from the side cut through. "He played better than a pro. Everyone here knows it." It was David Chen again, his voice calm but threaded with something unyielding. The audience reacted, as though he had stamped the conclusion with an official seal. Victoria's smile tightened. Marcus remained still, his expression neutral, though there was an unmistakable steadiness in the way he stood, as though the center of the room had shifted toward him and he was not about to step aside. He wasn't gloating, he simply occupied the moment as if it belonged to him as much as anyone else here. That quiet claim was harder to confront than open defiance. The crowd was hungry now, not for champagne or the next auction lot, but for resolution. The dare had turned into a social contract, and they were the witnesses. A few guests shifted closer to the stage, their phones angled for the perfect clip. The security guards remained where they were, but their posture had changed. They were no longer shielding Victoria from Marcus, but standing in neutral watch, their eyes darting between the two as though uncertain which way the evening would break. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the back without being raised. "I don't want a wedding. I want you to do what you said you would." It was a simple sentence, stripped of anything that could be spun into an admission or a plea. The room caught its breath. Victoria's gaze flickered briefly toward the cameras before returning to him. "Then what would keeping my word mean to you?" she asked. Her tone was level, but the phrasing revealed the small pivot from whether she would keep her word to how she could define it. Marcus let a moment pass before answering, the silence making the air feel more solid. "It means accountability. It means remembering this moment and not letting it end when the music stops." From the corner, Gloria Johnson's voice broke in, warm but direct. "Call him by his name, Miss Whitmore, start there." It wasn't a challenge, just a statement of fact that seemed to land heavier than intended. Victoria looked toward Gloria, the recognition passing between them swift and wordless. She turned back to Marcus. "Marcus Reed," she said, the syllables precise. "You've made your point." The use of his name was small, but the effect was immediate. People shifted in their seats, the atmosphere loosening just slightly. Marcus inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement that neither conceded nor demanded more, but the moment was far from resolved. The crowd still wanted closure, and closure here meant action. David Chen, sensing the tension, stood fully now, hands loosely clasped in front of him. "There's more than one way to keep a word," he said. "It doesn't always end with the literal terms of a bet, but it does have to end with truth." His voice carried the authority of someone used to distilling complex judgments into sentences the public could absorb. A few people nodded, the logic satisfying to those who wanted both principle and flexibility. Victoria understood the opening he'd given her. She could reshape the terms, present an alternative that appeared generous yet kept her dignity intact. But she also understood the danger. If the offer rang hollow, it would be dismissed as performance. The stakes were no longer just personal, they were reputational, corporate, and immediate. She could feel her PR director's eyes on her from across the hall, calculating the optics in real time. "I'll say this," she began, shifting her weight subtly. "Talent deserves recognition, and sometimes recognition means more than applause, it means opportunity. So Marcus, if you're willing, I'd like to discuss something after tonight, something that lasts longer than a song." It was careful, practiced, the kind of promise that left space for negotiation and escape. But Marcus did not let the space stay empty. "We can discuss it," he said, "but we'll do it in front of the people who heard you make the promise." It wasn't defiance, it was precision, and it locked the conversation back into the public sphere, where eyes and ears could hold it accountable. A low hum of approval rose from one side of the room. Some guests leaned forward, interested less in the specifics than in the fact that the balance of the evening had shifted again. Victoria exhaled, almost imperceptibly, and gestured toward the microphone. "Then come forward and speak." It was a gamble, offering him the same stage she had commanded only minutes earlier. If he stumbled, the power would swing back to her. If he didn't, well, that was the risk. Marcus stepped toward the mic with the same unhurried gait he had used to approach the piano. He didn't look at the cameras, he looked at the crowd itself, scanning faces as if memorizing them. "Some of you came here tonight to raise money for causes you care about," he began. "Some came to network, some came because it's tradition. I came because I work here." A few guests shifted in their seats, unused to being addressed so plainly by someone in a staff uniform. "I've been here for 5 years. Most of you have never noticed me, and that's fine, that's part of the job. But tonight, you noticed me. Not because I did my job, but because I did something you didn't expect me to do. That's the part I want you to remember, not the surprise, but the fact that it was possible." His voice was even, his words deliberate. Miss Whitmore made a promise, and promises mean something when they're made in public. I'm not asking for anything more than that. Keep your word in a way that matters, not just to me, but to everyone here who's ever been told to stay out of frame." It was not loud, but it was undeniable. When he stepped back, the space between him and Victoria felt narrower, even though neither had moved closer. The applause that followed was steady, not explosive, the kind that signaled agreement rather than entertainment. Victoria took the mic again. "Then we'll talk about what keeping my word means before this night is over," she said, "and we'll do it where it began, in front of witnesses." Her eyes swept the crowd, and the faintest smile returned. "You'll have your answer before you leave." The murmur returned, this time tinged with anticipation rather than tension. Phones were raised again, ready for whatever came next. The music from the ensemble started softly in the background, but for most people, it was little more than texture. Their attention was still locked on the stage, on the man who had walked out of the margins and the woman who had to decide how she would meet him there. The applause tapered off in uneven pockets, not because the room was ready to move on, but because everyone sensed the next beat would matter more than the last. The Whitmore Grand's great hall seemed to exhale in a single breath, the kind that comes before a plunge. People shifted subtly, not toward the buffet tables or the bar, but toward the open space between Marcus and Victoria. The air itself felt tilted toward them, like the rest of the evening was dangling from a single thread stretched between two people who had never stood on equal ground until now. Victoria handed the mic to an assistant without looking away from Marcus. Her movements were precise, the kind of practiced control that came from years of hosting rooms like this. But control tonight had stopped being a private possession. The crowd had its share of it now, and it was quietly deciding how much to give back. David Chen moved a step closer to the front, his attention locked not on the spectacle, but on the undercurrent, the shift in posture, the tilt in people's heads, the tightening ring of guests near the stage. As a critic, he'd spent his life watching rooms move, and tonight's was moving in a way that said the performance wasn't over, even though the music had stopped. Gloria Johnson stood at the edge, her hand still resting on the folded napkin she'd been holding since before the first note. She wasn't looking for an outcome she could celebrate or a headline she could repeat. She was watching for something simpler, whether the line between staff and stage, the invisible one everyone here accepted without question, could be stepped over and left behind without someone quietly pushing Marcus back to his side. The PR coordinator had her phone half raised, eyes darting between the two central figures and the trending dashboard on her screen. Notifications were climbing in real time, hashtags spinning off in parallel, some celebratory, some mocking, some sharpening into criticism that would live far longer than this night if it wasn't addressed. She knew the safest thing for her client would be to wrap the moment, redirect attention, and get the evening back on schedule. But safe and possible were not the same thing anymore. Victoria stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and Marcus by half. The crowd adjusted with her, like the shifting of a tide to follow a moon. "You want me to keep my word," she said, her tone still even but pitched for the room rather than the cameras. "And I will, but I need you to understand something. In my world, words are currency. Once they're out there, they can't be taken back. They can be honored or broken, and honoring them has to mean something more than theater." Marcus didn't flinch. "Then make it mean something." It wasn't sharp, it was steady, the kind of reply that didn't challenge for dominance but refused to yield ground. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, measuring something she wasn't used to measuring, the strength of someone with nothing to lose in a conversation that could cost her a great deal. "Fine," she said finally, "we'll do this properly, tonight." She turned slightly, raising her voice toward the crowd. "You'll get your answer before you leave, not a promise dressed for photos, a decision that matters." That was all it took for the hum in the room to swell again. Conversations reignited, not in distraction, but in speculation. The stakes had shifted from gossip to governance, and people were already positioning themselves to witness the resolution. Phones were set to video mode, ready to capture the moment when talk became commitment. David Chen leaned toward a nearby journalist, speaking in a low tone meant for one, but carrying just far enough. "If she does this right, it'll be worth more than any auction piece tonight." The journalist's pen moved without hesitation. Marcus stepped back from the mic, not retreating, but allowing the space to breathe. His presence didn't shrink, it simply moved into a different kind of gravity, one where every motion he made seemed to carry the same deliberate weight as the music he'd played earlier. Victoria gestured toward the string ensemble, and the musicians began again, but the notes sounded different now, not because the players had changed their style, but because the audience was no longer listening to them. The music was background again, yet the background had been altered by what had come before. Even the servers, resuming their careful weave through the crowd, carried themselves with a subtle shift in bearing, as if the room's balance had tipped enough for them to feel it. Gloria moved along the perimeter, exchanging quiet words with a few of the staff stationed at the walls. They didn't smile or nod, but there was a change in their eyes, the same change she'd seen in Marcus's posture when he sat at the Steinway. It was the small but dangerous knowledge that the frame you've been kept out of isn't locked after all. Near the back, two guests debated in low voices. "She'll spin it," one said, sipping a drink. "She has to," the other shook their head. "Not this time, too many witnesses, too much on record." Both turned back toward the stage as if waiting for the next cue. Victoria's PR director approached, her phone still glowing with live metrics. "We can frame this," she whispered. "Scholarship fund, diversity initiative, it can work." Victoria's jaw tightened. "No slogans, not tonight." The words were quiet, but carried the unmistakable tone of someone choosing a path before fully knowing where it led. The minutes stretched, filled with the sound of silverware, murmured theories, and the faint strains of music that no longer commanded attention. Marcus remained where he was, hands loosely clasped in front of him, the way someone might stand while waiting for a conversation to resume. He wasn't restless, and he wasn't trying to read the room. He had already done what he came to do, the rest would either happen or it wouldn't. Finally, Victoria signaled for the music to stop. The sudden quiet folded over the hall, leaving only the muted clink of a single glass being set down somewhere near the bar. She stepped forward again, no microphone this time, but her voice was clear enough to reach the farthest tables. "We're going to speak now," she said to Marcus, "and when we're finished, we'll come back here and tell them what we've decided." It was an invitation, but it carried the weight of a command. Marcus didn't break her gaze. "Not to hide," he said, "to make it right." The distinction hung in the air for a beat before she gave a single, sharp nod. Security moved without orders, clearing a narrow path through the crowd toward the side doors. People shifted to let them pass, but their eyes stayed fixed on the pair at the center. Conversations paused as they walked by, not in deference, but in the reflexive quiet that follows when something rare and unplanned is unfolding in real time. The door closed behind them with a muted click, sealing the noise of the great hall on the other side. Inside the smaller anteroom, the air felt cooler, the light softer. Victoria crossed to a low table, placing her hands on its edge. Marcus remained standing, the distance between them neither confrontational nor deferential, just steady. "You want me to keep my word," she said, "so tell me what that looks like to you." The question was direct, but her tone was less so. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being in control, but aware she was no longer the only one holding the steering wheel. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He glanced toward the closed door, then back to her. "It looks like you using the position you have to change more than just this room. Start with respect. Name people. Stop locking them out of the frame they make possible. And make sure what happened tonight isn't remembered only because of a joke." She studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a taut thread. "That's not small," she said finally. "No," he replied, "it is." Outside the door, the room waited, the expectation thick enough to be felt even from here. Inside, the conversation was just beginning, but both of them understood that whatever they decided, it would not be theirs alone once they stepped back into the light. The small anteroom was quiet enough for them to hear the faint hum of the air system, the occasional click of glassware from the hall beyond the door. The light was warm but dimmer than the grand hall's chandelier glare, making the shadows softer, more forgiving. Yet the air here was taut, stretched by the weight of what both knew they were deciding. Neither sat down. This was not a conversation for comfort. Victoria moved first, circling to stand opposite Marcus across the table. She placed her hands flat on its polished surface, the lacquer gleaming faintly beneath her diamond rings. The gesture wasn't aggressive, it was the stance of someone steadying herself before entering unfamiliar territory. "You're asking for change," she said, "but change that sticks doesn't come from a single promise made in the heat of a moment." Her voice was even, but it lacked the hard edges it had carried in the hall. Marcus kept his posture open, one hand resting lightly on the back of a nearby chair, the other hanging at his side. "I'm asking for the promise to be more than a headline," he said, "because in a week, this will be gone for most people here. They'll move on to the next night, the next gala, the next headline. But for the people who work this building, the way things are stays the same unless someone like you decides it shouldn't." She studied him for a moment, as though weighing whether he was speaking for himself or for something larger. "And you think I have that much power?" The question was rhetorical. They both knew the answer. Marcus didn't smile, but his eyes stayed steady. "You have more than most, enough to make this mean something." Victoria exhaled, glancing toward the door as though she could feel the crowd's pulse through it. "If I do this, it has to be real. It can't just be a symbolic gesture. That's the only way I walk back in there and keep my credibility." She straightened, letting go of the table. "So what exactly are you asking for?" Marcus stepped around the chair, closing the distance between them by half. "I'm asking for a program that opens that stage, and others like it, to people who have been told they don't belong there, not just once. Every year, paid, promoted, supported, and not decided in secret." The clarity in his tone made it sound less like a request and more like a blueprint. Her brows lifted slightly. "That's ambitious." "It's necessary," he countered. "You said yourself, honoring a word has to mean more than theater." For a long moment, Victoria was silent. Her mind was moving quickly, assessing the cost, the optics, the potential backlash, the unexpected support. A decision made here could ripple far beyond the Whitmore Grand. Finally, she nodded once, not slowly, but with the speed of someone making a choice she knew would hold. "All right, we'll make it happen, but it has to be announced tonight in that room so it's on record, and you'll be part of that announcement." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Then let's go." The door opened to the muffled thrum of the grand hall, conversations, the clink of glasses, the low hum of the string ensemble filling space without commanding it. Heads turned almost immediately. It was as if the room had been holding its breath and had just spotted the point of release. Marcus and Victoria walked side by side, not touching, but the visual was enough to spark a fresh ripple through the crowd. David Chen's eyes tracked them as they approached the stage. He recognized the difference in their expressions, hers sharpened with decision, his grounded in a quiet certainty that suggested he already knew what was coming. Gloria Johnson, watching from near the service corridor, straightened her posture. She caught Marcus's eye for half a second, and he gave the smallest of nods, enough for her to know the conversation had gone somewhere beyond damage control. The ensemble stopped mid-piece at a subtle signal from Victoria's PR director. The room's noise tapered, curiosity overtaking distraction. Victoria stepped onto the stage first, motioning for Marcus to join her. The sight of them standing side by side under the chandelier's glare carried its own charge, not one of equality, but of acknowledgement. "Thank you for your patience," Victoria began, her voice carrying easily without strain. "When I made my remark earlier this evening, it was in jest, but Marcus Reed's performance reminded me, and all of us, that talent, dedication, and artistry are not bound by position or title. They are bound only by opportunity." She let the sentence hang for a breath, scanning the room to make sure she had it. "I told Marcus I would keep my word," she continued, "and together we've decided what that means. Starting this year, the Whitmore Grand will sponsor an annual performance program, open to staff members, community musicians, and anyone who's been told they don't belong on stages like this. The program will provide training, mentorship, and paid opportunities to perform here, in this hall, before audiences who might never have heard them otherwise." A ripple of reaction moved through the guests, surprise from some, approval from others, and the quick calculation of PR value from a few more. Phones lifted higher now, capturing every word. "This is not a one-time gesture," Victoria said. "It will happen every year without exception. Marcus Reed will help shape the first season." The applause began before she finished the sentence. It was not unanimous, some clapped out of obligation, but it was strong enough to fill the room. Marcus stepped to the microphone, his tone the same measured calm he'd had all night. "Thank you, not just for me, but for the people you haven't met yet, the ones who will stand here because of this. I'll make sure the first year sets the standard for the ones that follow." When they stepped back from the microphones, the applause didn't stop immediately. It carried, rolling in waves, until it softened into the hum of renewed conversation. The string ensemble resumed, but now the music seemed to sit differently in the space, as if it were part of a larger score. Victoria moved toward the edge of the stage, stopping near Marcus. "That's the easy part," she said quietly, almost so only he could hear. "The hard part is making sure it happens." Marcus gave a small, steady smile. "Then we'll make sure." Gloria approached as they stepped down. She didn't say anything, just met Marcus's eyes and nodded, the way someone does when they've seen a line crossed and know it won't be uncrossed. David Chen lingered near the back, already making mental notes for the column he would write, one that would speak less about scandal or spectacle and more about the night. The center of the room shifted. By the time Marcus returned to the perimeter of the hall, the buzz of conversation had shifted. He was no longer invisible. Guests nodded to him as he passed, some offering a few words, others just acknowledging him with a look. The cart he'd left earlier was still where he'd parked it, but the distance between that cart and the stage no longer felt as far as it had at the start of the evening. In the corner, the black Steinway sat gleaming under the chandelier, its lids still open. The keys waited in silence, but they were no longer just furniture for the background of an elegant evening. They were part of the night's record, not in a program, not in a schedule, but in the living memory of everyone who had been there when the music changed the room. The applause had long since settled into the layered hum of conversation, but the current in the room was not the same as it had been when the night began. Before, it had flowed in predictable channels, the rich exchanging updates with the rich, the staff moving like quiet tributaries along the edges. Now the channels crossed in subtle, unplanned ways. Guests leaned towards staff to ask questions. Servers who had been trained to keep moving paused when spoken to, and instead of waiting for a tray to pass, a few guests walked over to meet them. These were small shifts, almost invisible in the grand expanse of marble and gold, but they were there, and Marcus noticed. He stayed near the perimeter, not because he was retreating, but because it gave him the vantage point he wanted. From here, he could watch the new intersections form, the quiet test of whether the evening's declaration was more than just a passing display. A server he recognized, Ethan, caught his eye while carrying a tray of champagne. Ethan's eyebrows lifted, the expression somewhere between disbelief and admiration. Marcus responded with a small nod, nothing more, but in the silent vocabulary of staff who had worked together for years, it was enough. Near the stage, a small group of donors stood in a loose circle, their voices pitched low. David Chen passed by them slowly, catching fragments. Good optics if they actually do it. Someone will have to manage the selection process. It's the kind of thing that gets picked up in the right media. He didn't linger, but he filed each remark away. The program's success, he knew, would depend not only on Marcus and Victoria, but on how many people in this room decided it was worth defending when the night's glamour wore off. Gloria Johnson, still stationed at the edge of the hall, watched Victoria moving through the crowd. The woman was speaking to people she always spoke to, but there was a difference now, fewer perfunctory smiles, more deliberate eye contact. Gloria could read the shift in her body language. Victoria wasn't just salvaging her own reputation, she was actively working to plant the announcement in people's minds as something they were part of, not just something they had witnessed. If she succeeded in that, the program might survive its first year. Marcus was pulled from his observations by a voice at his side. "You're not hiding in the service corridor tonight," Ethan said, keeping his tone quiet enough for only them to hear. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "No reason to." Ethan tilted his head toward the stage. "Never thought I'd see that happen here." Marcus's eyes followed the gesture. "Neither did I." A pair of guests approached them, a man and a woman, both dressed in the muted elegance of people who didn't need to flash their wealth to prove it. "Marcus Reed?" the man asked, his hand extended. Marcus shook it, the grip firm but unhurried. "We just wanted to say," the woman added, "that was extraordinary, not just the music, all of it." Marcus inclined his head. thank you. He didn't linger to make conversation. He knew the value of letting people keep their own experience of a moment without crowding it. Across the room, Victoria had found her PR director again. The woman's phone screen glowed in the dim light, a cascade of notifications rolling upward. "It's out," she murmured. "Clips are already trending. Some news outlets are picking it up without us sending anything." Victoria's gaze shifted toward Marcus, then back to her director. "Then make sure the story doesn't shrink. Keep the focus on the program. If this turns into a personality piece about me or him, it loses weight." The director nodded, fingers already flying across the screen. David Chen moved deliberately through the crowd, stopping here and there to answer questions. He had no intention of publishing a piece that would flatten the night into a novelty. He wanted the texture, the uneasy pause after the last note of Marcus's performance, the silence before the applause, the way Victoria's eyes had shifted when she realized the dare was no longer hers to control. Those moments, he knew, would matter more in print than any single line of dialogue. In the service corridor just outside the hall, a small knot of staff had gathered near the water cooler. Most were on break. A few had drifted back here out of habit. Their voices were low, but the mood was charged. "She's actually gonna do it?" one asked, disbelief and cautious hope mingling. "That's what they said," another replied. "In front of everybody." A third, older employee gave a short laugh. "Let's see if we're still talking about it next month." Gloria stepped into the corridor, her presence quieting the group without effort. "It's on record now," she said simply. "That means it's ours to hold them to." Back in the hall, Marcus accepted a glass of water from a passing server, his throat dry from the hours of listening and speaking. The water was cool and sharp, grounding him in the moment. He was aware of how many eyes still drifted toward him, some openly, some under the pretense of casual glances. He didn't mind it, but he also didn't feed it. The point had never been the spotlight. The point was to keep the door open once it had been pushed. A guest he didn't recognize approached, tall, silver-haired, with a voice like polished wood. "Marcus," he said, "I serve on the board for the Philharmonic. We're always looking for ways to widen the pipeline. If you'd be willing, I'd like to speak with you about performing or curating for one of our community programs." Marcus nodded once, the kind of agreement that meant he'd follow up but wouldn't be drawn into a detailed conversation here. "I'd be interested," he said. The man smiled faintly. "Good, I'll make sure we find each other." Victoria reappeared near him then, the crowd parting slightly as she approached. She wasn't smiling, but her expression was open, and that in itself was notable. "They're talking about it," she said under her breath. "That's the first step." Marcus met her gaze. "The second is making sure they keep talking about it for the right reasons." She didn't dispute it. Instead, she gave the smallest of nods, as though they'd agreed on more than the words had said. As the night edged toward its official close, the crowd began to thin. Coats were claimed, final drinks were sipped, and conversations drifted toward the practicalities of leaving. Yet the undercurrent remained, a sense that the evening had not been quite like the others before it. Guests departed with programs in their hands, some with fresh notes typed into their phones, others already drafting the story they'd tell when asked about the night. In the quiet that followed, Marcus returned his cart to the service area. The gloves he'd folded earlier were still there, untouched. He slid them back on, the familiar fit a reminder of the work that would resume as usual tomorrow. But he knew, and so did Gloria, and so did Ethan, and so did anyone who had been paying attention, that something in the room's balance had shifted, and not just for the length of a song. In the grand hall, the Steinway's lid was still open. Someone would close it before morning, but for now, it sat waiting under the dimmed chandelier, the last glint of light catching on its keys. The morning after the gala, the Whitmore Grand's facade caught the pale winter sun in a way that made its gold accents burn bright against the cold sky. Inside, the marble floors echoed with the light shuffle of housekeeping carts and the muted hum of vacuum cleaners. The kind of ordinary soundtrack that returned after the last champagne flute had been cleared away. But the air felt charged, like static before a storm, because the previous night had not ended when the guests left. It had simply moved into a different kind of stage. In Gloria Johnson's small office near the laundry chute, the hum of the washing machines mixed with the faint ding of her phone. She leaned over her desk, reading headlines that had already made the rounds online. Billionaire's der backfires. Janitor stuns crowd with piano mastery. From maintenance to maestro. Marcus Reed redefines the grand to launch staff performance program after gala surprise. The last one was from a respected arts journal. Gloria read that one twice. She knew enough about the media to understand that the type of outlet covering a story often mattered more than the number. And this one, with its readership of critics, curators, and donors, would reach people who made decisions about funding and programming. In a corner office several floors above, Victoria Whitmore sat at her glass desk, laptop open to a dashboard of metrics. The PR director was packing, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, the coverage is mostly positive," she said, weaving between the armchairs like she was navigating a minefield. "Yes, some outlets are framing it as a gotcha moment, but the majority are focusing on the program announcement. No, we're not commenting further until we release the formal statement." "Yes, I'll send you the talking points." She ended the call, exhaling as though she'd just stepped off a treadmill. Victoria closed her laptop and turned her chair toward the window. She could still see the Steinway in her mind, the way Marcus had looked at it before sitting down, not as a challenge, but as a familiar friend. The dare had been a reflex, an old weapon she'd used in countless rooms to tilt the balance in her favor. But this time, the balance hadn't tipped back. It was still shifted, and she was deciding whether to lean into that or fight to restore the old weight. Across town, Marcus sat at a small table in a quiet diner, his coffee cooling beside him. He wasn't scrolling through headlines. He'd already read the ones that mattered and ignored the ones that didn't. His phone buzzed with messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. Some were congratulations. Some were invitations disguised as congratulations. He answered none of them immediately. Instead, he opened the small notebook he carried in his jacket and began writing names, people he'd known who could benefit from the program if it actually happened. The list grew slowly, each name a thread in something larger than himself. At midday, the board of the Whitmore Grand had convened in a conference room whose walls were lined with framed photographs of past seasons, gala nights, symphony openings, ballet premieres. The president of the board, a man with the measured cadence of someone used to negotiating with donors, cleared his throat. "So," he said, "our patron-in-chief has made a public commitment." A few members chuckled, though the sound was tight. "The question is how we implement this without derailing the season's budget." A woman 2 seats down tapped her pen against her notebook. "The announcement is already getting national attention. If we are strategic, this could increase donor engagement, especially among younger patrons who care about inclusion." Another member, older, leaned back in his chair. "Or it could alienate long-standing supporters who expect a certain standard." The word standard landed in the air like a coded signal. The discussion looped for nearly an hour, logistics, costs, optics. In the end, they agreed to form a small committee to oversee the program's first year. Victoria would chair it. Marcus's name was added as a co-chair. The decision was recorded in the meeting minutes, which, unbeknownst to most in the room, would later be leaked to a journalist who had been at the gala. That afternoon, David Chen filed his column. He wrote not of scandal or spectacle, but of tension, the rare kind that builds when 2 people enter a room with completely different maps and leave having agreed, at least temporarily, to walk the same path. He described Marcus's performance without romanticizing it, and Victoria's pivot without excusing the circumstances that had made it necessary. The piece ended with a line that readers would quote in social media posts for days. "The night did not change the balance of the world, but it shifted the balance of a room, and sometimes that is where change begins." Back at the Whitmore Grand, the staff cafeteria buzzed in a way it rarely did. Breaks overlapped, conversations spilled over from table to table. "They're saying he's gonna be running the program," Ethan told a dishwasher named Leela. "Not running it exactly," Leela replied. "Co-chairing, but still that's not nothing." Gloria, sitting 2 tables away, sipped her tea and listened without interrupting. She knew the mood here was fragile, equal parts excitement and skepticism. Promises had been made before, though never this publicly. As evening fell, Marcus returned to the building, not for work but for a meeting with Victoria. They met in the rehearsal room behind the stage, a space lined with mirrors and lit by fluorescent panels. The grand piano here was not as polished as the Steinway, but it was tuned, and Marcus let his fingers rest on its keys while they spoke. Victoria arrived with a slim folder under her arm. "The committee, in place," she said. "First meeting next week. I want you there with a list of candidates." Marcus nodded, tapping a soft chord into the air. Already started, he said, sliding his notebook across the piano lid. She flipped through the names, pausing at one. Who's this? A security guard from the conservatory uptown, Marcus replied. Plays cello, never had a paid gig. Victoria closed the notebook gently. This is going to take more work than the board realizes. Then we'd better start now, he said. Over the next 3 days, the story didn't fade, it deepened. Local news outlets sent crews to film interviews with Marcus in the service corridors, juxtaposing them with footage from the gala. National arts programs invited Victoria to speak, but she declined most, choosing instead to let the written statement stand until the committee had concrete details to share. This restraint, rare in her world, earned her unexpected praise in certain circles. By the end of the week, the Whitmore Grand's inbox was flooded, some with applications for the program, others with endorsements, and more than a few with criticism. You're lowering the bar, one email read. This space should be reserved for the best. Marcus read that one twice, then closed the message without replying. He knew arguments about who belonged would outlast the news cycle. On Friday evening, as the last of the week's events wrapped up, Gloria found Marcus near the loading dock. They're talking about you upstairs, she said. Not just about the program, about you. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Good or bad? Both, she admitted, which means you're doing something that matters. She didn't stay for his reply, she just clapped his shoulder once and walked away. That night Marcus stayed late in the rehearsal room, the soft light pooling around the piano as he worked through pieces he hadn't played in years. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that let him hear not just the music, but the faint echo of the gala's applause, not as an end, but as the first note of something still being written. The committee met in a high-ceilinged conference room on the Whitmore Grand's mezzanine, a space usually reserved for contract negotiations and donor strategy sessions. The walls were lined with framed black-and-white photographs of the building's most celebrated performances, each image an unspoken reminder of the standard the institution prided itself on. The long table gleamed under recessed lighting, the polished wood reflecting the neat rows of leather chairs. It was the kind of room designed to make people speak carefully. Marcus arrived early. He'd learned long ago that in rooms like this, the person who entered first was often the one who set the tone, even if they didn't speak right away. He placed his small notebook at the table's edge and poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher in the center. The surface of the water rippled slightly when he set the glass down, the sound strangely loud in the otherwise silent space. Victoria arrived next, carrying a slim tablet under her arm. Her presence shifted the atmosphere, even in an empty room. They'll trickle in, she said, taking the chair at the head of the table. Don't mistake that for lack of interest. It's how this place works. Marcus nodded. I'm used to people showing up late to something they don't think matters yet. Over the next 15 minutes, the rest of the committee filtered in, board members in tailored suits, a few department heads, and 2 guest advisors brought in from outside the organization. Names were exchanged, handshakes offered. Some members greeted Marcus warmly, others with the polite reserve of people unsure where to place him in their mental hierarchy. One man, a tall figure with a silver tie pin, gave him a nod that felt like acknowledgement without welcome. The meeting opened with Victoria outlining the program's intent, her words concise but confident. This initiative, she said, is designed to expand access to professional performance opportunities for individuals historically excluded from spaces like ours. It will be open to staff, community members, and others identified through our outreach network. Selection will be merit-based, but the definition of merit will not be limited to traditional pipelines. The phrase "not limited to traditional pipelines" drew a subtle tightening of shoulders around the table. Marcus caught it, a flicker here, a shift there, but said nothing yet. He wanted to hear the resistance before confronting it. She finished. Victoria gestured toward him. Marcus will be co-chairing the first season. He's brought a preliminary list of potential candidates. Marcus slid his notebook toward the center of the table and opened it to the first page. He spoke plainly. These are people I've known personally or through others, a security guard who's played cello for 20 years, a housekeeper who sings with a local gospel choir, a former line cook who composes electronic music on borrowed equipment. A woman at the far end of the table, hair pulled into a precise bun, leaned forward. Are these individuals formally trained? Her tone was neutral, but the question hung in the air like a measuring tool. Marcus met her gaze. Some, yes. Some have no formal training but have performed for years in other settings. The point of this program is to remove the assumption that formal credentials are the only measure of ability. The man with the silver tie pin cleared his throat. I don't think anyone here is against opportunity, he said, but we have a brand to protect. Patrons expect a certain level of excellence. If the performances are inconsistent, it could diminish the Whitmore's reputation. Marcus leaned back slightly, not in retreat, but in deliberate pause. You mean if they don't match the level of the people already on this wall? He gestured toward the photographs lining the room. Some of those people weren't welcomed here when they started, but someone let them in anyway. That's the only reason their pictures are up there now. The silence that followed was taut, but not entirely hostile. Victoria broke it. The program will have an audition process, she said. It will be curated with the same care we give our main season. The difference is, the net will be cast wider. One of the outside advisors, a middle-aged woman with a background in community arts, spoke up. We've seen similar programs succeed when they include mentorship components. Pairing participants with established artists can help maintain quality while honoring the program's mission. Heads nodded around the table, some out of agreement, others out of relief at a practical suggestion. Marcus took the cue. I'm fine with mentorship, he said, as long as it's not used as a gatekeeping tool to decide who gets to perform. This isn't an internship, it's a stage. The conversation rolled forward, sometimes smooth, sometimes snagging on points of language, professional standards, audience expectations, sponsorship optics. Marcus listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, he made sure his words carried enough weight to leave a mark. He noticed the subtle patterns, the way certain members addressed Victoria directly but avoided looking at him, the way others sought his eye contact, as if to signal quiet alignment. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed on a basic framework. Auditions would be held in 3 months, with the first performance scheduled for the following season's opening week. A mentorship component would be included, but final selection authority would rest jointly with Marcus and Victoria. The decision was recorded in the minutes, along with a note that the program would be reviewed after its first year. As the members began to leave, the man with the silver tie pin lingered by the doorway. Mr. Reed, he said, his tone courteous but cool, I'll be interested to see how you balance ideals with reality. Marcus met his gaze without blinking. Sometimes ideals are reality, he said. It just takes someone willing to see them. The man gave a faint, unreadable smile and walked away. When the room was empty, Marcus and Victoria remained seated. You saw it, she said, the resistance. Marcus closed his notebook. It's not surprising. What matters is whether they fight it quietly or openly. She studied him for a moment. And you? I've been dealing with quiet fights my whole life, he said. I know how to win those. They left the conference room together, descending the broad staircase that overlooked the lobby. From above, Marcus could see staff moving through their routines, polishing brass railings, vacuuming rugs, carrying trays. It looked like any other day, but he knew some of them had been waiting to hear what happened in that room. He caught Gloria's eye across the lobby and gave her a brief nod. She returned it with the faintest smile. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone in the rehearsal room. The Steinway in the grand hall was locked, but the smaller piano here was available. He played for nearly an hour, not practicing for an audience, but reminding himself of the thing at the center of all this, the music itself. The notes filled the empty space, each one a quiet assertion that what had been promised would be kept, no matter how many photographs on the walls suggested otherwise. The weeks after the committee's first meeting were filled with the kind of administrative work that seemed designed to exhaust momentum. Emails multiplied, agendas expanded, and meetings spawned sub-meetings. At first glance, it looked like progress, calendars filling with action points, bullet points stacking neatly in shared documents. But Marcus began to notice the pattern beneath it. Decisions that should have taken days were being deferred to the next meeting. Questions that had already been answered were suddenly reopened for further discussion. He wasn't surprised. Resistance didn't always announce itself with outright opposition. Sometimes it wore the face of cooperation, but its hands moved slowly enough to keep the clock from turning. One afternoon, Marcus sat in the mezzanine lounge, waiting for Victoria to finish a call. Through the glass wall of the adjacent conference room, he could see 3 board members speaking in low voices, their expressions carrying the relaxed certainty of people who believed they were unobserved. The man with the silver tie pin leaned forward slightly. If we keep expanding the mentorship criteria, the auditions will have to be pushed back. That buys us time to reconsider the budget before this thing actually launches. The woman with the precise bun nodded. And if the first year stalls, we can quietly let it fade out without it looking like we pulled the plug. The third member, one Marcus didn't recognize, tapped a pen against his notepad. We just have to make sure Whitmore doesn't make this her personal crusade. She's unpredictable when she decides something's hers. Marcus didn't move, didn't look away. He filed every word in the same mental space where he kept musical phrases, patterns to be recalled exactly when needed. Later that day, when he and Victoria met to review the candidate list, he mentioned none of it. Instead, he pointed to the practical delays already in motion. "They're not saying no," he said, "but they're slowing it enough that it might as well be no." Victoria's jaw tightened. "I know, I've been through this before. The difference is, this time it's public. That limits how quietly they can bury it." She leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing. "But we'll have to make the next steps impossible to stall without showing their hand." They began reshaping the plan. Instead of waiting for the committee to approve outreach, Marcus started contacting candidates himself, inviting them for informal rehearsals in the building's smaller spaces. These weren't official auditions, but they were enough to let him gauge readiness, and more importantly, to have proof in hand that the talent existed. Word spread quickly among the staff. The security guard with the cello, the housekeeper with the gospel voice, the line cook with the electronic tracks, they all began appearing in the rehearsal room in the evenings. Some sessions were rough, others startlingly polished. Marcus recorded each one, labeling the files with the performer's name and the date. The folder grew steadily, a quiet arsenal against any claim that qualified candidates couldn't be found. Meanwhile, resistance outside the rehearsal room was becoming more calculated. Committee emails began arriving with urgent, new proposals, detailed mentorship timelines that would push the audition date back by months, sponsorship requirements that would need a long courting process, venue restrictions that conveniently excluded the Whitmore Grand for scheduling reasons. Victoria saw through it as quickly as Marcus did. "They're trying to run the clock out," she said one morning over coffee in her office. "If they push the first performance into the next fiscal year, they can argue it's a budget casualty." "Then we don't wait for their calendar," Marcus said. That afternoon, he sent invitations for a showcase, not to the full committee, but to a carefully chosen list of allies. The 2 outside advisors, Gloria, David Chen, and a handful of donors who had publicly praised the program after the gala. The showcase would be in the Whitmore's rehearsal hall, informal but filmed, with the clear purpose of showing the program's potential before it could be smothered by delay. The night of the showcase, the room filled with folding chairs, a makeshift stage at the far end. The performers were nervous, but Marcus had chosen the order carefully, starting with a confident act to set the tone, building toward the most technically impressive performance near the end. Victoria sat in the front row, her presence steady but not overbearing. David Chen took notes in the second row, his pen moving with the slow precision of someone documenting not just the performances, but the atmosphere in the room. The security guard's cello filled the space with a warm, resonant sound that seemed to erase the bare walls. The housekeeper's voice carried gospel notes that made even the most skeptical guests shift forward in their seats. The line cook's layered electronic piece was unlike anything the Whitmore stage had ever hosted, but it drew a burst of applause that startled even him. By the end, the energy in the room had shifted. There was no need to argue merit. It had been demonstrated in real time. Victoria leaned toward Marcus as the last applause faded. "They'll have a harder time stalling now." The next committee meeting proved her right, though not entirely. The silver tie pin man acknowledged the showcase was impressive, but insisted the official process still had to be thorough. The precise bun woman suggested that the performances might benefit from a year of development before a public debut. Marcus let them speak, then pulled out a USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. "Every performance from that night is on here," he said. "You can watch them and decide for yourself whether they're ready." But the audience that was in the room already decided. It was a quiet challenge, and he didn't push it further. He knew the value of letting evidence speak when words would only give opponents more room to maneuver. After the meeting, Victoria caught up with him in the corridor. "You cornered them without making it a fight," she said. "That's the only way this will work." Marcus shrugged. "They've been playing this game a lot longer than I have, but I've been listening to people try to talk me out of things my whole life. The rhythm doesn't change much." Still, he knew the resistance wasn't finished. If they couldn't kill the program outright, they'd try to shape it into something unrecognizable, a safe, symbolic gesture instead of the open door it was meant to be. He would have to watch every step, measure every compromise, and keep the original promise visible to everyone who cared about it. That night, alone in the rehearsal room, he opened the folder of recordings and let them play one by one. The music filled the space, layered with the memory of the performers, nervous smiles, the quick nods they gave him before starting. Each note was a reminder. This wasn't about winning a committee's approval. It was about making sure these voices reached the stage before the quiet hands behind the scenes could close it off again. It began with a single op-ed. The headline read, "Are we lowering the bar in the name of inclusion?" It ran in a well-known cultural review, the kind of publication that prided itself on being unflinchingly honest about the arts. The writer, a retired critic with decades of sway, argued that the Whitmore Grand's new performance program threatened the institution's artistic integrity by substituting goodwill for rigor. It was written in polished, measured language, but every paragraph carried the same underlying message. Opening the stage to uncredentialed performers was an indulgence the Whitmore could not afford. Within hours, the piece had been shared across social media, praised by some as speaking hard truths, condemned by others as elitist gatekeeping. It sparked threads, debates, and side-by-side video clips of Marcus's gala performance contrasted with archival footage of Whitmore's most celebrated artists. By the next morning, the story had spread to broadcast news. A morning show panel debated the program in a split-screen format, one commentator dismissing it as a PR stunt that will fade, another defending it as exactly the kind of shift the arts world needs. Marcus watched one segment over coffee, his expression unreadable, the volume low enough that the voices sounded like static. When he arrived at the Whitmore later that day, the lobby felt different. Staff still nodded at him, but there was a question in their eyes now, not doubt in him, but in whether the promise they'd heard that night would survive the storm. In the mezzanine, a pair of board members stood near the railing, speaking in tones just loud enough to carry. "This is why you don't make policy in the middle of a party," one said. "Now we're cleaning up the mess." Victoria was waiting for him in her office, a printout of the op-ed on her desk. "It's coordinated," she said, tapping the paper. "I've seen this before. Someone plants the seed in a respected outlet, others pick it up, and before you know it, the narrative is set." Marcus leaned against the doorframe. "Then we change the narrative." "That's the trick," she said. "If we push too hard, it looks defensive. If we stay silent, they define the terms." They decided on a middle path, neither attack nor retreat. The program's official social channels would release a short video, not of Marcus, not of Victoria, but of 3 of the program's candidates performing in rehearsal. No voiceover, no captions, just the music. "Let the work speak," Marcus said. The video went live that evening. It wasn't flashy, but it was genuine. The cello's low warmth, the gospel voices soaring clarity, the layered pulse of electronic beats. Each clip lasted just long enough to leave an impression before fading to black. Within a day, it had been shared thousands of times, often by people who had never heard of the Whitmore before. But the pushback didn't stop. A new article appeared in a regional arts magazine, quoting anonymous Whitmore insiders who claimed the program lacked proper oversight. Another piece speculated that the budget would divert funds from core artistic programming. Both were careful to present these claims as concerns, but the effect was the same: sow doubt, create hesitation. The next committee meeting was sharper than the last. The man with the silver tie pin opened with, "We can't ignore the public reaction. Even if we disagree with it, perception becomes reality in our world." The precise bun woman added, "We need a public statement clarifying that all performers will meet the same high standards expected on this stage." Marcus kept his voice even. "If we wanted everyone to meet the exact same standards as before, we wouldn't need this program. The whole point is that there are other ways to measure worth besides the path that leads through conservatories and networks most people will never have access to." Victoria backed him. "We're not diluting quality, we're expanding the definition, and the first performance will prove that. Until then, we hold our ground." The meeting ended without resolution, but Marcus knew they'd succeeded in one thing: they hadn't let the language shift entirely to the opposition's frame. That night, David Chen called. "You're in a moment where silence won't save you," he said. "They're building a case in the public square. You don't have to answer every critic, but you do need to show your hand before they convince the crowd you've got nothing to hold." The advice stayed with Marcus. 2 days later, he agreed to an interview not with a major network, but with an independent arts podcast known for long-form, unedited conversations. In the recording studio, he spoke plainly about his own path, the people he'd met through the program, and the performances already taking shape. He avoided defensiveness, framing the program not as a gift, but as a long-overdue correction. When the episode went live, it didn't go viral in the way the op-ed had, but it reached the right listeners. Musicians, educators, and smaller arts organizations shared clips, calling the program a model worth watching. The tide didn't turn overnight, but the water was no longer flowing entirely in the other direction. Inside the Whitmore, however, the resistance adapted. Certain rehearsal spaces suddenly became unavailable due to maintenance. Budget line items for the program were flagged for further review. Meeting agendas grew longer, with the program's section pushed toward the end when time was already running out. Marcus responded by finding workarounds. When a rehearsal room was locked, he borrowed space from a community center across town. When budget questions stalled purchases, he brought in donated equipment from contacts he'd built over the years. Each solution was quiet, but deliberate proof that the program could keep moving without waiting for permission. One evening, after a rehearsal at the community center, Marcus walked home through the winter chill, his breath fogging in the streetlight. He thought about the night at the gala, the moment when the air in the Whitmore's grand hall had shifted. That moment had been public, undeniable. What he was doing now was the opposite: small, invisible moves in borrowed rooms against opponents who would never admit they were opponents. Still, he knew which kind of fight lasted longer, and he was ready for it. 3 weeks before the debut, the Whitmore Grand's rehearsal rooms were busier than anyone could remember. The main stage was still reserved for the regular season's productions, but the smaller spaces throbbed with music, voices, and the low hum of preparation. The cello's deep resonance drifted down one hallway, gospel harmonies down another, and in a back room, the layered loops of an electronic track built steadily until they filled the air like a tide coming in. Marcus moved between rooms without carrying a clipboard, without issuing commands. He didn't need to. The performers knew why they were here and what was at stake. Each rehearsal was a step toward proving that the promise made months ago was more than a clever line at a gala. Victoria visited twice that week, her presence drawing longer stares than Marcus's. She walked the space with the air of someone taking inventory, not of talent, but of readiness. After sitting through the housekeeper's gospel set, she turned to Marcus in the doorway. "They're not just ready," she said. "They're dangerous to anyone still hopping. This will fail." He smiled faintly. "That's the point." The danger wasn't lost on their opponents. In the committee meetings leading up to the debut, the language became sharper. "We should consider reducing the program's slot to a matinee," the silver tie pin man suggested. "It's still technically a debut, but lower profile. Less risk if the reviews are mixed." The precise bun woman pushed for a change to the program order, moving the strongest performers earlier in the show. "We need to capture the audience quickly," she said. in case the later acts can't hold them. Marcus recognized the strategy's subtle framing, designed to make the program feel like a novelty act tucked between real performances. He met Victoria's gaze across the table and saw the same calculation in her eyes. When she spoke, her tone was calm, final. The program will remain in prime time, and the running order stands as planned. Any change now would undermine the integrity of what we've built. There was no formal vote. The silence that followed was its own resolution. Outside the boardroom, momentum was building in ways even the resistance couldn't touch. David Chen's latest column, timed for maximum reach, painted the upcoming debut as a collision between the Whitmore's past and its possible future. Local arts blogs picked up the story, framing it as a must-see event. Tickets moved quickly, partly out of curiosity, partly because the price point, lower than the Whitmore's usual rates, drew in audiences who rarely crossed its marble threshold. 2 weeks out, Marcus gathered the performers in the largest rehearsal space they'd been given so far. Folding chairs lined the back wall, a table with paper cups and a water cooler in the corner. "This isn't about proving them wrong," he told them. "It's about proving yourselves right. Every note, every breath, that's yours. They can't take it away, no matter what they write the next day." The security guard cellist nodded slowly. The housekeeper singer closed her eyes, absorbing the words. The line cook tapped his foot against the floor, his mind already running through beats. After rehearsal, Gloria pulled Marcus aside. "You've got some people upstairs already talking about year 2, she said. "They're not all in, but they're not all against it anymore. That's new." Marcus knew better than to take it as victory. "They're hedging their bets," he said. "If it goes well, they'll say they supported it all along. If it doesn't, they'll say they warned us." The final week brought the usual chaos of live performance, equipment delays, last-minute illnesses, scheduling conflicts, but there were also less accidental obstacles. One evening, Marcus arrived to find the rehearsal space double-booked with a string quartet from the main season. The scheduling mistake was met with polite apologies from the coordinator, but Marcus could see the satisfaction in the silver tie-pin man's eyes when he passed him in the lobby. Instead of arguing, Marcus shifted the rehearsal to the community center again. The room wasn't as polished, but it was warm, familiar, and the performers played like they had something to prove. If anything, the detour sharpened them. 3 days before opening night, the dress rehearsal finally took place in the Whitmore's main hall. The Steinway gleamed under the stage lights, its presence almost ceremonial. As each act ran through their set, Marcus stood at the side of the stage, listening not just for technical precision, but for the moments when the music filled the space in a way that made the hall itself feel different. When it was over, Victoria approached him in the wings. "They're ready," she said, no hesitation in her voice. "Ready doesn't mean safe," Marcus replied. "It never does," she said. "That's why it's worth it." In the lobby afterward, a small knot of staff gathered, their faces lit with something between pride and disbelief. "Never thought I'd see this in this building," Ethan said. "Not like this." Marcus glanced toward the empty hall. "Tomorrow you will." That night he didn't go straight home. Instead, he walked through the Whitmore's silent corridors, past portraits of celebrated performers from decades past. Their faces stared out in sepia and black and white, frozen in eras that had never made room for the kind of debut about to happen. He paused in front of one photograph, a pianist mid-performance, eyes closed, fingers blurred on the keys. There was no plaque naming the people who had kept that stage closed to others like him, but Marcus didn't need one. He understood exactly what kind of barrier the program was about to test. The night before opening, Victoria sent him a brief text, "Full house, no more moves to make, see you on stage." Marcus stared at the message for a moment before setting his phone down. The fight had narrowed to a single point in time, the moment when the lights came up and the first note sounded. Everything before had been about getting to that point. Everything after would depend on what happened once it began. The Whitmore Grand had always been impressive, but on opening night, it looked like it had been built for this moment. The chandeliers glowed with a steady gold light. The marble floors caught the reflections of jewel-toned gowns and tailored suits, and the air carried that electric hush that settles over a room when everyone knows something is about to happen. In the lobby, ticket scanners beeped steadily as guests filed in. Some were there out of genuine anticipation, others out of curiosity, and more than a few to confirm their doubts. The murmurs rose and fell in small waves, conversations punctuated by the clink of glassware and the rustle of programs. Backstage, Marcus stood with the performers in a narrow hallway lined with coat racks and cables. The gospel singer hummed low, her voice like a slow warm-up before sunrise. The cellist tuned and retuned his instrument, not because it needed it, but because the ritual steadied him. The electronic composer scrolled through his setlist one last time, fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the edge of his equipment case. Victoria stepped into the hallway, her black evening dress understated but commanding. "House is full," she said quietly. "They're seated. Once this starts, there's no taking it back." Marcus nodded. "That's the idea." The stage manager gave the 5-minute call. The performers exchanged glances, not words, because there was nothing left to explain. Marcus led them toward the wings, the muffled sounds of the audience just beyond the heavy curtain. When the lights dimmed, a low murmur swept the hall, followed by a ripple of applause as the MC introduced the program. The first act stepped into the spotlight, the cellist, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. His bow met the strings, and the sound rose up like it had been waiting for years to fill that space. It was rich, unhurried, and so deliberate that by the third measure, even the doubters were leaning forward. Next came the gospel singer, her voice rolling out like a tide, lifting and breaking in waves that carried the hall with it. She didn't just sing, she told a story with every phrase, her hands moving like they were shaping the air itself. Somewhere in the third verse, a man in the third row, one of the board's most skeptical members, lowered his program and simply listened. Then came the electronic set. The lights shifted, cool blues and deep purples washing the stage. The beats built slowly, looping and layering until the audience was surrounded by sound they'd never heard in the Whitmore before. It was modern, yes, but it was also meticulous, every rise and fall placed with the precision of a symphony. By the time the track dropped into its final, pulsing bass line, the crowd erupted in applause that was louder than anyone expected. Marcus followed last. He crossed the stage without hurry, sat at the Steinway, and let his hands rest on the keys for a moment before playing. The first notes were soft, almost conversational, but they unfolded into a piece that carried pieces of everything that had come before: the cello's depth, the gospel's lift, the electronic's layered rhythm. It wasn't a solo, it was a summation, a way of saying, "This is what we've built together." The final chord hung in the air for a long moment before the audience realized it was over. Then the applause came, strong and sustained. People stood, some quickly, some slowly, until the hall was full of rising bodies and open hands. Backstage afterward, the mood was somewhere between elation and disbelief. The performers hugged, laughed, and took quick, blurred photos on their phones. The stage manager moved through with a clipboard, ticking off post-show notes, but even she couldn't hide a smile. Victoria appeared in the wings, her expression composed but her eyes bright. "You did it," she said to Marcus. "We did it," he corrected. In the lobby, the post-show crowd buzzed with conversation. David Chen moved among them, his notepad in hand, catching fragments. "Didn't expect to like it, but never seen that mix of styles here before. Makes you wonder why they haven't done this sooner." Not all the comments were praise. A man in a grey suit near the coat check muttered to his companion, "Still think it's a gimmick. Let's see if they can sustain it." But even his tone lacked conviction. In the committee lounge upstairs, the silver tie-pin man poured himself a drink and said nothing. The precise-bun woman sipped hers slowly, eyes on the floor-to-ceiling window. Neither congratulated Marcus directly, but neither repeated their earlier objections. For now, they were silent. When the hall finally emptied, Marcus returned to the stage alone. The Steinway still held the warmth of the lights, the faint smell of polished wood rising in the air. He touched the keys once, not to play, but to feel the weight of what had just happened. Gloria appeared at the edge of the stage. "You know," she said, "some of them will try to act like this was their idea all along." Marcus smiled faintly. "Let them, as long as the stage stays open." They left together, the vast hall behind them already returning to its quiet, the sound of footsteps fading into the marble corridors. Outside, the winter air was sharp, the city lights stretching ahead. The program wasn't safe yet. It would face new challenges, new attempts to control or reshape it. But tonight, the balance of the room had shifted again, and this time, it was on record. If you've been following this story from the opening dare to the final chord, you felt the same tension every note carried, the weight of expectation, the sharp edge of doubt, and the quiet force of proving them wrong. But here's the truth. The Whitmore Grand Stage isn't the only one in the world. There are rooms in every city, in every town, where doors stay closed to voices and talents that don't fit the old script. This night wasn't just about a billionaire's pride or a janitor's skill. It was about showing what happens when the rules change, even for a moment. When the person cleaning the floor one day is center stage the next, not because of charity, but because they've always belonged there. Now the question isn't whether it can happen again. It's whether you'll be part of making it happen. Share this story with someone who believes the gate is locked. Tell it to someone who holds the keys. Bring it to the people who decide who gets to walk on stage and the people who have been told they never will. If this night moved you, don't let it end in applause. Carry it forward. Support the stages in your community that make room for everyone, not just the chosen few. Show up for the performers who have been playing in the shadows, waiting for their moment in the light. Because somewhere right now, there's another Marcus, another voice, another sound waiting behind the curtain, and all it takes is one open door, one risk taken, one audience willing to listen. Be that audience. Help open that door. Make the stage theirs.